Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Something in the closet. The paranormal experience I want to share with you happened in my bedroom. In my bedroom was a mirror in which I could see myself if I faced a certain way. As I was trying to go to bed one night, I suddenly felt like something was watching me, and at that moment I felt an incredible amount of fear. My heart was beating out of my chest, and with a quick glimpse into the mirror as I was laying on the bed was a tall shadowy figure in the shape of a man. But this man had no face, and it was standing directly over me. The shadowy figure wasn't a solid human shape, but rather looked like it had an all-black robe on with whiffs of black smoke coming from its body. The moment I saw the figure, I was frozen with fear, but I managed to put a blanket over my head. I stayed under the sheets for what seemed like forever and mustered up the courage to peek into the mirror to see if the shadowy figure was still looking at me. I lifted up the sheet and with one eye peeked into the mirror, and in the mirror I saw the figure even closer to me than before. Again, I retreated to under the sheets. After a few minutes of staying absolutely still, I started to hear coming from my closet door. Once that happened, I said, "Fuck it," and sprinted to my parents' bedroom and jumped into their bed. I was in 8th grade and my dad was in the army. So his reaction was a little bit of, "What the hell are you doing?" He told me to go back to my room, and I absolutely refused. My mom had believed me and showed me some pity and allowed me to sleep in their bed that night. My dad was stationed back to the States about 2 months later, but I will never forget that night. Okinawan Ghost. I was stationed in Okinawa in 2004 and stayed there for about 4 years. Nothing ever weird happened to me until one evening when I was taking a stroll down to a nearby place called the Olympic Chapet. This route took me through a tree line of jungle for about 50 feet. We usually like to walk at night because of the cool breeze. Occasionally you would see the Okinawan bats flapping around at night and hear them screeching. This never bothered us. Tonight was a different story. My hands are still shaking while writing this on the keyboard. We are very afraid of what we saw. We walked over to the chapet around 9 p.m. like we normally do. On the way back, we were walking next to the jungle tree line and something caught our eye. We thought a person was standing there in the brush. We looked and sure enough, it was. We figured it was a local, maybe farming some land out in the jungle. We got to looking and the person was not moving. We pushed the stroller closer and realized it was an apparition. There was an old Okinawan man in a straw hat with drooping jowls staring at us blankly, not moving. Only, this is hard to say, he had no body. It was just shadowy mass. The jungle was right behind him. My wife and I just stared in disbelief of what we were seeing. His head then faded away. He did not just back into the jungle, the head just disappeared. Right then and there, it faded. We ran home pushing the stroller as fast as we could and locked the door behind us. My wife is still shaken from it. We never believed in ghosts. Now I see why this place has a reputation for being haunted. I am now a believer in the afterlife. I will never walk past that spot again. The little girl's ghost. This past summer I was visiting my dad and mom on Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa. Everything was going great. I've never really believed in ghosts or apparitions, and I had always heard that Okinawa was haunted. On my 3rd day there, we had a cookout to celebrate my 15th birthday. The neighbor's dog was at our house. One of them was following me around because I kept giving it treats. I went upstairs to my room and the dog stopped at the door. It started growling and its hair was bristling. I didn't understand. My older sister had told me that none of their dogs, which they had gotten rid of, would ever go into that room for some reason. So I decided to do a little experiment. I picked the dog up and brought him into the room, set him on my bed, and stepped away. The dog went crazy. He started barking and growling and bristling. He ran to the closet and started scratching on a spot on the ground. The spot in my closet had always been darker than the rest of the carpet in my room. Then the dog literally jumped on the spot and tried to bite it. As soon as that happened, the power went out. The room immediately got cold. A few seconds later, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a spark of light illuminate a corner of my room. The dog bolted out the door, yelping all the way. The street lamp outside my window flickered, and I went over to the window. Outside there was a little girl I had never seen before. She was crying and holding her knee. I was on the second floor, but I can climb out my window and get to the ground floor from my roof. So I climbed down and started walking towards the girl. I asked her what was wrong. She looked up and she said, "Help me, please." And then she disappeared. She literally just faded away. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen and experienced. I'm still freaked out, and I'm back in the States now. It's been like 7 months since then. Needless to say, every night I was there, I looked outside at the same time to see if she was there, but she never was. The Strange Visitors. A few years back, my uncle, with whom I was very close, was diagnosed with cancer and was told that his condition was terminal. Over the next several years, he underwent experimental treatments as he wanted to exhaust every possible remedy. But in the end, he had become broken and bedridden all the same. Each member of my family took turns visiting and taking care of him as he slowly passed away. By the end, he had moved into my grandmother's house, and I made it a point to stop by each day to lend a hand and to help provide moral support, as it was such a trying time for everyone. The first incident that happened occurred at my grandmother's house while I was visiting with my mother and brother. I had passed out on my grandparents' couches in a state of consciousness that one feels as a dream ends and waking begins. I remember being awoken by someone asking me, "Are you Charlie? Charlie? Charlie?" I remember saying, "Yes, that's me." I looked up and saw a vague outline of a woman standing in front of me, but instead of being a person, it was just a large black hole. The voice sounded like a combination of my grandmother and bizarre electrical signals coming from radios when you have it tuned halfway between two stations. The voice continued, "I've been trying to call my sister, but she's not answering her phone. Would you please tell her that I will be here to pick up my brother when he finally gets his ass in gear?" I remember mumbling something, then being woken up by my mother as she entered the room. "Are you on the phone?" she asked. "No, why?" "I heard you talking to someone. They were asking if you were Charles." I told her I was having a dream about speaking with some woman, but I did not mention what she said. My aunt, who was my mother and my uncle's sister, had died 2 years before I was born, and after having reflected on this over the last few years, I feel like it was either her ghost or a mental construct my mind created to assist myself during the stressful time. I have no definite opinion except that it was extremely bizarre and that I want to keep an open mind about it. The second incident happened one day when I was stopped by my grandparents' house after finishing classes at the community college I was attending at the time. When I arrived, my grandmother warned me that my uncle did not wish to have anyone visit him at the time. I assumed this was due to the constant vomiting and bowel issues that take place when one is battling cancer. My uncle was a very independent, proud man and would not have wanted anyone, let alone his nephew, who had always looked up to him, to see him in that condition, so I understood completely. I decided to finish up some homework, then headed home. I started in on the homework, then out of the corner of my right eye, I saw someone walking past my grandparents' dining room table. I looked up from my school books and saw an old man making a beeline for my uncle's room, located at the end of the hall. To this day, I can still remember he was wearing a long-sleeved gray shirt and a black leather vest. And he had no feet, or rather, his legs seemed to fade away and disappear just below the knees. My heart jumped and I sat stunned for a few seconds. I didn't feel any kind of cool air as I've heard described in other supernatural accounts, which bear some similarity to this, but rather felt an almost hypnotic jerk, falling sensation. My grandparents' den or family room lay immediately to my left, so I stood up and walked inside, certain the person I saw must have been one of them. I had my doubts because my grandfather had suffered a stroke a few years before, and my grandmother's legs in a cast due to her diabetes, and I was fairly certain neither of them could have moved as quickly as that man did I had seen just a few seconds before. "Were one of you guys up and walking around?" I asked my grandparents. "No," my grandmother said. "So you're seeing things too now?" I told her what had just happened, and she then told me about a few incidents that had happened to her and my mother a week or so earlier, in no way similar to what I'd witnessed. She said they wanted to tell me and my siblings, but refrained from telling me as they thought we would think that they were crazy. I left the house immediately and went to the store to buy a pack of cigarettes and smoked half the pack on the way back to my grandparents' house. When I arrived, my grandmother told me that my uncle was ready to see me. So I went into his room, helped him change out his water bottle, and made some small talk with him, and then just prepared to head home. I had seen enough for one day and had to go home and process whatever it was that I had seen that afternoon. As I left, I said what I always made a point to say whenever I left my uncle, which was, "I'll see you when I see you." At that point, it really could have been any day, and in fact, it was almost 2 weeks later exactly that he died. So I tried to make it as neutral sounding as possible. When I said it this time, however, my uncle grabbed my arm and stared into my eyes, and with the biggest shit-eating grin you've ever seen said, "You will." I finished the pack on the way home. Has anything similar happened to anyone else out there? I wonder. The haunted nursing home. There are quite a few things that have happened to me since I started at this nursing home. We have quite a few tricksters that love to linger in your peripheral vision. I'm a certified nursing assistant, and I work the graveyard shift at this particular nursing home. There is one instance that has really unnerved me, though. One of our residents was dying. For 3 nights in a row, when I would go to check on her, there was a woman sitting in her chair just watching her. But when I would do a double take, she was gone. I never got a good look at her. I would only catch a side view because of the angle of the chair. There was also a time when one of our residents died, and for about 3 or 4 days, the call lights went crazy, dinging, and we couldn't shut them off. It happened close to midnight every night. Well, I finally figured out what was going on. I called out, "Okay, mister, I know it's you. This must be your way of saying goodbye. We love you and will miss you very much." My nurse thought I was nuts, but they quit after a while and haven't had any trouble with them after that. So many things happen, it's hard to tell about all of them. It's mainly cold spots or seeing something out of the corner of your eye or seeing shadows pass. But it's definitely not a place to work for the faint of heart. Uncle Rob. My wife and I are renting a very small home. It has 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a living room, and a kitchen that our homeowner's insurance company tells us was built in 1901. My neighbors are Dutch Indonesians and my wife is Chinese Indonesian. After moving into the house, we noticed that we would hear unusual rattling sounds from the kitchen, and then our coffee pot would rattle as well. I came home a couple of times to find the television on, although we both recalled turning it off before leaving the home, and it was curiously set on sports stations. Hockey games, basketball games, etc. We also noticed that we would lock the windows from inside the house, only to find them open when we arrived home. About 3 months into moving into the house, I returned from a business trip to have my wife tell me that she had seen a ghost-like figure walk by the backside of our house. I asked, of course, if it was something else, like a trick of light in the backyard. She assured me it was not. The very next morning, we both saw him walk past the house. It was a male figure, wearing what appeared to be white clothing. He seemed to ignore us and was just walking by the house. That night we prayed and asked our Episcopal priest about possibly coming by to bless the house. We then went away on a 3-day trip only to learn that our neighbor's son had seen his deceased Uncle Rob sitting on the front porch. It turns out that Uncle Rob had lived in the house for over 40 years before he passed away. Now, any time Uncle Rob rattles some dishes, we politely ask him to stop, and he does. This last summer, my wife and I were in the bedroom, and we both heard a male voice, which we couldn't make out what he was saying, so we both just decided to say hi to Uncle Rob, and since then we have not heard the voice again. We now view Uncle Rob as someone who is still looking out for his old house. We no longer fear him, but give him respect, and he gives us respect as well. We have told the Episcopal priest about what occurred, and he then told us about the ghost at our church. The lesson we have learned is that living with a ghost like Uncle Rob is like dealing with a history of our house. When replacing a fuse in a fuse box the other day, I could not help to think that I was doing something that Uncle Rob had done many times over the years. We now view him as something like a guardian angel over this property. Who knows? If we were here living another 40 years, maybe we would want to visit it after we had passed on. My haunted apartment. My name is Mary, and I have lived in my apartment for 10 years. Ever since I moved in, strange things have happened. When I first moved in, I saw a black figure go walking down the stairs. It's a 2-level apartment, and then go walking into my bedroom. It was as if this figure of a woman was oblivious to anything going on around her. To this day, if I shut my bedroom door, it will rattle very loudly as if someone is trying to get in. Also, I have heard loud bangings on the walls when I am the only one home. 3 years ago, I had the most convincing things happen here. My daughter was changing my granddaughter's diaper, and she went to pick up the diaper and it wasn't there where she had laid it down. Then all of a sudden it fell over her shoulder onto her lap. Also around the same time, I went to open the kitchen cupboard and my pills came flying out at me. I always keep these pills on the kitchen counter. Also, the cat's toy moves by itself over to the other side of the living room. But the biggest experience I had was just as I had come home from working the afternoon shift. It was about 11:30 p.m. and I was making a snack and my phone rang once. This is the ring that it makes when someone's in the lobby wanting to come into the building. It startled me and I turned around, and there in front of me was a sort of silver wavering mass, just like if you look down a road on a hot summer day. I gasped because it scared me, and it disappeared. Also, one night, just lately, I was laying down on my bed to go to sleep, and it felt like I had someone lay on top of me, and then they went right through me and got up. It made me gasp. It sort of took my breath away. It felt weird, and it absolutely scared me. Many things have happened. I could write a book about them. However, I'll have to be moving soon, as they're making these apartments into condominiums, and I just wonder what's going to happen to whoever decides to live in this space after me. The Hooded Ghost. I had almost forgotten about this occurrence and was only reminded of it when driving down a particular piece of road, but there seems to be similar sightings across the UK of a large hooded figure. It was in the early hours of New Year's Day 1996-97. I had finished work at a nightclub and a friend of mine picked me up probably around 2 a.m. Neither of us had been drinking, and I should point out I reserve judgment on the paranormal. It was a crisp night and was lightly snowing on a bypass called New Cut Road, and there was approximately a 3-mile stretch of road with barriers on either side, hilly ground on the oncoming traffic or driver's side, and the passenger side consisted of a banking slope and trees further away from the roadside. We were going quietly down a 60-mile-per-hour stretch, possibly at just 30 to 40 miles or less, and we were around halfway point on the bypass and had just passed a sign. There were no trees on the passenger or my side, just a drop and darkness with the moon highlighting the trees. As a sporadic snow fell in the yellow and white lit air, I could see a figure beyond the barriers. It was large, around 7 to 8 feet tall. It appeared hooded with no features, just blackness. I can only compare it to the hooded figures in the film by the Frighteners or The Lord of the Rings. However, and I know this is a contradiction, the figure was transparent but solid. A deep and intuitive feeling of dread and fear came over me, a giddy feeling of falling off a bike as a child mixed with a heightened fear of not wanting to go downstairs in the dark. It felt ominous and evil, something I have never felt since, apart from possibly sleep paralysis, where you know you are dreaming but can't wake up out of the dream. I looked to my friend, who could see it too. He gave out a yell and put his foot on the accelerator. The car skidded. If I had looked to my left as we passed the figure, I would have come face to face with it. However, for some reason, I turned looking right over my shoulder to the rear window, looking to the left side back window between the passenger and the driver's seat. In retrospect, it may have been to distance myself from the figure and the passenger window. The figure appeared to lunge forward as it came through the back of the car. We drove on, and as I watched it, it was lost in the darkness. When we stopped the car outside my house, the side of the car had a large film patch over the door and part of the window. It may have already been there and was just a coincidence. I can't be sure. But the substance of film looked like a smear on a knife after cutting cheese. I was so scared that I had to wake my family, thinking that I may die that night and that this figure was a warning or a sign of something to come out of like a Dixonian tale. Of course, I'm still here. I couldn't help but think this horrific experience meant something, and we both returned to the area by foot days later, expecting possibly to find a clue, an injured person, or even a dead body. We walked almost the whole length of the road and never found anything. Sometime later, the Times newspaper ran a story on a hooded figure sighting, which gave me some credence to the events, a kind of reprieve. I have no idea what it was, but it scared the living daylights out of me. Something behind me. Living in a small town can be hell. You try to figure out ways to entertain yourself, so when someone says, let's go to the cemetery and find out if it's really haunted, you're not going to say no, which is exactly what happened to me. About mid-October, everyone is wanting to experience something a little scary to get in the mood for Halloween. My friends and I decided to look up some of the most haunted places in Northwest Florida. We were determined to find something close to give us the feel for our upcoming holiday. After an hour of researching on the internet, we finally stumbled upon a rumored haunted cemetery about 20 miles from our house. The article said many people have been there and attempted to walk the 3-foot wall along the cemetery and have been pushed off by a greater force, but no one was there. Some have said that the back right corner of the cemetery is haunted, and you can see a figure walking across the graves while stopping to look at gravestones. Also, it's rumored that next to the Virgin Mary gravestone provokes a ghost that will be aggressive to get you out of the cemetery gates. So definitely, we had to check this out for ourselves. When we arrived at the blockade, which you have to climb over to get back to the cemetery, there were other people standing there talking amongst themselves. One of my friends asked them if they had experienced anything during their stay down there. They simply told us not until they were walking back, and we should use caution because of the coyotes. My friends and I took about 20 minutes to decide whether we would take the 1.5-mile walk back to the cemetery or not. 3 out of 5 agreed that this could be one of the coolest or scariest things we had ever encountered. Towards the end of the walk down the twisting and turning dirt road, we finally saw something ahead besides the trees. And there stood the gates of Coon Hill Cemetery. Just peering over the wall and looking at the gravestones was creepy enough for most of my friends. Only 2 of us were brave enough to test the myths, myself and my best friend. Climbing up on the wall was not easy, and getting a good grip was just as challenging. My best friend and I walked along the entire wall without feeling a single force trying to push us off. We then started to wonder if the things on the internet were true or not. We decided then to walk through the cemetery towards the back right corner. I felt nothing at first as we were passing along the headstones dating back to the early 1800s. But the closer we got to the Virgin Mary statue, the harder it became for me to breathe. My best friend and I stopped for a moment for me to catch my breath. The Virgin Mary statue stood directly in front of me. Suddenly a huge gust of wind came through, and the hot, sticky night seemed to get a little bit chillier while we were standing there. We started to move close towards the statue and the wall when suddenly something slapped the bare skin on my back quite hard, and the flashlight I was holding in my hand cut off. The pain and stinging on my back felt as if a human had slapped me with full force. My best friend and I turned around and walked very fast away from the statue and back out of the gates. Once we reached everyone else who was standing a safe distance away, my friends checked out my back. There was a perfect handprint that was still red with skinny fingers, and there was dirt marks down my back. I had not had any contact with the ground or any type of dirt. After this, I was too freaked out to venture back into the gates or even walk the wall. I took the slap as a warning to get out of there. My best friend, being as daring as he is, decided to walk the wall again to see if us being in the gates stirred up any activity that would lead to something. As he was walking across the wall and crossed over the gate in the back right corner, he approached the Virgin Mary statue. I witnessed him start to walk a little bit slower. Then suddenly he went flying from the wall towards the trees once he was a little past the Virgin Mary statue. Once he got up, he ran towards us. He told us that it had been like he was slapped and pushed off the wall with great force. He took his shirt off to reveal that he had the same handprint on his back as I had on mine. We left the cemetery after the last event happened. The next day, my best friend and I woke up and felt extremely nauseated. I have no doubt whatsoever that all the claims I read about that cemetery is haunted are very much true. The ghost of Route 441. This is one of my friend's cousins, and he told me that he and his friends were driving back from Oshkosh on Route 441 when they saw a girl ahead. She was walking with her suitcase heading in the same direction. They stopped and asked the girl if she would like them to give her a ride. She agreed and rode with them. They asked the girl what her name was and why she was out walking on the road at night. She told them her name and then told them she was heading back home from college when there was an accident, which is why she was walking at night. They asked her where she was going and if they could drop her off there. She told them that her family was going to pick her up near a gas station at the exit of the highway to Appleton. The two boys told her that they are also from Appleton. They asked her what her family name was, and she told them her parents' name and the name of her family. When they arrived at the gas station, they asked if they could all just exchange phone numbers so that they could contact each other and perhaps decide to hang out. They all exchanged phone numbers. Then they all departed. Later that night, when the boys got home, they tried calling her to see if she had gotten home safely. When her mother picked up the phone, they asked if this is the girl's house. The mother answered yes. They asked if they could speak with her daughter. The mother was confused and asked the boys, "What are you talking about? She died a year ago." They got confused and explained what had happened and how they had met. The mother told them that where they had picked her up was where she had died in a car crash. Haunted Riverview. Riverview was an old abandoned building at the end of the city. A few people had bought it now and then, only to leave it in a hurry to be bought by someone else. No one could tell why people left it so fast, but they didn't think too much of it. No one even knew what had been in that house before. One day a family of 5 moved in. They liked how the house was old-fashioned and still had some of the furniture from the turn of the century. There was a Mr. and Mrs. Smith, their daughter Mary, who was 14, their son John, who was 12, and their daughter Leah, who was 4 and was the youngest of the family. For a few weeks, everything seemed to be okay, until one day Leah became very close to an imaginary friend that she had named Ida. "She's not imaginary," argued Leah. "She's real. She told me all about herself." "Oh, really?" said Mrs. Smith while they were washing the dishes. "What things may that be?" "Oh, you know," said Leah, "like that she likes dolls and that type of stuff." However, as the days went by, Leah did not like to be questioned about Ida. "She is very sensitive," she told her father. "Leave her alone." No one thought much about Ida until Leah added about 10 more imaginary friends to her list. There's Samantha and Agnes and George and Mildred and Henry. Mr. and Mrs. Smith began to build up concern about their daughter, but they figured if they gave it time, then maybe it would pass. That is, until one day, Mary swore she saw a box move in the attic. Her parents didn't believe this themselves, until out of the blue, Leah found a doll that she named Ashley. The doll seemed to be old-fashioned, just like the house. And then they started to get concerned and decided to do some research on the house. They went to the library and got information about Riverview Manor. Shocked, they learned that Riverview had once been an orphanage, but had been closed down after a smallpox incident in 1904. They soon began to believe less and less that what Leah was seeing was imaginary friends, and more likely that they were ghosts. They finally decided to have a talk with Leah to ask her more about Ida and to tell her about Riverview. But Ida didn't die in a fire, claimed Leah. I don't think she died at all. But she always says she feels hot. Luckily, the next door neighbor, Mrs. Green, said she might know something about Ida, so the Smiths invited her over for tea. My mother used to tell me stories about her childhood friend, Ida Mae Stone. She lived right next door, in the Riverview orphanage. They were inseparable, she and my mother, but you see, back then, they weren't immune to any of those diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, smallpox, all of those. 10-year-old Ida died in 1902 due to typhoid fever. Poor thing, so young. The Smiths couldn't believe what they were hearing. After thanking Mrs. Green, they were positive Leah was seeing ghosts, so they took the doll away from her and moved to another town, one with less nonsense. And so Riverview is still there to this day, waiting for more people to move in and become companions for those lonely ghost children. My family moved into the house in 1975. I was only a year old, and my mom lived there up until 2009. It was my childhood home, and I remember it not always being a happy place. I spent a lot of time in my room, which is the only place I could get peace from the hustle and aggravation that went on from day to day in the family. I don't remember how long after the first meeting with the other world did I have my second encounter. I was still a child and very scared. I was only about 8 when I laid in my bed one night reading, as I did quite often by this age. I looked up to see a partial formation of a full-bodied apparition appearing about 10 feet away from me. It took me about 30 seconds to focus and see what was materializing in front of me. Fear gripped me intensely. My throat tightened. My tongue went dry, so much so I couldn't make a sound. My body froze. It took me an age for legs to engage with my brain and manage to move them. What I did see before I bolted for the door was a young girl, in old clothes, maybe Victorian era, standing in front of me. White outline with visible features, a very pretty girl, not very old, maybe late teens. She never made a move and stood stock still, but just looking at me. I didn't wait round for her to come towards me. I ran out into the landing and down the stairs. My mom did not believe me, and my dad just laughed. I was petrified, quite rightly, but upon investigation, she had vanished, as is the case with many sightings. I knew what I had seen, though, and it never left me. And years after that, for some reason, we came to the conclusion that the presence that had invaded our lives was attached to the wardrobe which we were given a few years before. The incidents of paranormal events became more frequent after this wardrobe came into our house. Maybe someplace in memory, transference, whatever it was, it had come to us with this wardrobe. Other incidents that occurred after the wardrobe came to us came thick and fast at one point in time. Maybe 1 or 2 incidents a week, and it wasn't just me. It was the whole family who experienced it. My mom, my brothers, not sure about my dad because I don't think he would have admitted it, even if he had experienced it. He is not the man to admit that sort of thing. A lot of events, such as seeing shadows moving around rooms, even from outside the house, electrical equipment turning itself on and off at all times of the day and night, pictures on the wall would swing and hang at funny angles, items like keys would disappear from one place for days on end, then reappear somewhere else. A friend of my mom swears, even to this day, that she saw a German Shepherd in the bedroom window, standing on its hind legs with its front paws on the windowsill, As children, we had dogs, but never owned a German Shepherd. A lot of the time, we would feel like we were never alone, even when we were quite obviously alone. The spine-tingling hair on the back of the neck stands up, creeping sensation that someone would be standing at the back of me when I turned around, but of course there never was anyone there. One other incident that stands out in my memory and has never been explained away by anyone in my family. At the top of our stairs, just off the landing, is the bathroom. It can be seen from the bottom of the stairs quite clearly. There used to be a rug outside the bathroom door, which stretched from the top of the stairs to the bathroom door to the largest bedroom door. My mom had painted the bathroom one day, but had left painting the woodwork and door jamb until we were all in bed to avoid obvious accidents, such as it being touched or stepped on. She did the door jamb last of all, washed the brush, and went to bed quite late. In the morning, before any of us had risen from bed, I heard my mom talking to my older brother in the next room, asking him if he had been to the bathroom during the night. Then she came to me and asked the same question. I asked why, and she said one of us must have been out of bed, because on the rug on the landing was a humongous toe print in paint that came all the way from the wet paint out onto the landing, across the landing, fading towards the large bedroom door. I assured her I hadn't been out of bed all night. She said she assumed it wasn't me as my toes were really too small. I looked at this print and measured it against my own, and it was massive. Even my older brother's toes were not this big. My dad's toes were smaller than my brother's, so that ruled him out. It puzzled us for a long time, really perplexed us as to how someone's big toe print, just the big toe, could manage to be stained with paint and none of the others. And how come this toe was so massive that it ruled out anybody in the family? We never spoke of it in great depth after it happened, but years later, me and my mom had a conversation about it, and we must have thought the same thing at that time that it happened, but never said anything to each other. We both had thought that it was of the paranormal, but kept it to ourselves. I convinced myself that it was one of my brothers messing about like they do, but even to this day, they deny all knowledge of it. I think it's really scary to think that we may have been sharing space with something from the unknown. It had to be the strangest thing that happened in terms of weird stuff. Other things that happened seemed to be paranormal and were filed as such, but this was just freakily weird and could not be explained in any way. I think that that's why we never discussed it, because it was such a random out there event.